chains were not the only thing that bound slaves in the ancient world. Suffering cruelty and inescapable fate weighed heavier than any iron shackle. From the grandest empires to the most ruthless warlords, slavery was the lifeblood of civilization. Yet for those trapped in it, existence was nothing but agony. These weren't just servants or laborers. They were pawns in a brutal system where survival was a luxury few could afford. But among the countless horrors of forced servitude, some fates stood out as truly inhumane tasks, so terrifying, so merciless that death was often the only escape gladiator slaves forced to fight for Roman amusement. In the brutal world of the Roman Empire, few fates were as horrifying as that of a gladiator slave known as damnati et gladium, or condemned to the sword. These unfortunate men, often prisoners of war criminals or rebellious slaves, were thrown into the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum, forced to fight for the amusement of the Roman elite. Unlike the trained gladiators, who had a chance at wealth and glory, these fighters were little more than human sacrifices in a game of survival pitted against professional killers with no real hope of victory. The Muna, or gladiatorial games, were originally held as sorry rites, but by the time of emperors like Commodus, they had devolved into elaborate spectacles of execution. Commodus himself would take part, but unlike the real slaves he fought with, dulled weapons and rigged victories. Some slaves were not even granted the dignity of a proper fight. Many were stripped of weapons and sent into the arena to be mauled by lions, bears, and leopards in cruel venations. Others were chained together, in order to kill each other, ensuring that even in death their suffering would entertain the masses. Roman historian Seneca once wrote, "The morning was for men condemned to the beasts. The midday for men slaughtering each other, a grim reminder that for a gladiator slave death was the only certainty." Silver-mined slaves endured death in ancient Athens. Beneath the sun-scorched hills of Attica lay the Laurian silver mines, an underground nightmare where thousands of slaves toiled in conditions so extreme that death was often a release. These mines were the lifeblood of Athenian democracy, funding everything from its navy to its grand temples. But for those condemned to work there, it was a slow, agonizing death sentence, shackled in near total darkness. Slaves, many of them war captives, or debt-bonded laborers breathed in poisonous mercury vapors. A steed chiseled away at the rock, their lungs deteriorating with every breath. The historian Xenophon, in his work Ways and Means, wrote of how Athens viewed these enslaved workers as nothing more than a resource, easily replaced when their bodies failed. Aristotle in Politics noted that these men rarely saw the light of day, living out their short, miserable existence underground if exhaustion or disease didn't claim them. Cave-ins did tons of rock collapsing over frail bodies and tombing them wherever fell. The Peloponnesian War made things even worse as Spartan forces ravaged Attica. The mines became targets and countless slaves were either slaughtered on sight or fled into the wilderness, only to face starvation or capture. There was no escape from this grim fate, whether by suffocation, collapse, or the blade of an invader. Their suffering remained an unspoken cost of Athenian prosperity. Carthaginian galley slaves rode to death without rest in the heart of the Mediterranean Carthaginian. Warships cut through the waves, propelled by the relentless agony of slaves chained to their oars. These men, taken from conquered lands or condemned to servitude, were not warriors but tools of war, expendable engines of Carthage's naval dominance. The Punic Wars saw thousands of them crammed into the lower decks of massive quincy, where they rode in suffocating heat, whipped by overseers if they faltered. Denied rest, their bodies wasted away, their hands blistered and raw, their muscles strained to the point of collapse. Ancient historian Polybius, in his histories, described how Carthaginian admirals had no regard for their rowers, driving them like beasts until their bodies simply failed. The suffering reached its peak at the Battle of Egots, where a decisive Roman ambush shattered the Carthaginian fleet as warships capsized or burned. The chain slaves had no escape left to drown in the open sea, their masters saving only themselves. Even those who survived the battle faced no mercy. Captured by the Romans, they were either executed or thrown into harsher servitude, proving that for galley slaves, death was often the only release from the unending torment of the OMGL. human shields died for the Khan's conquests. Nowhere was human life more disposable than in the path of the Mongol war machine. As the empire expanded, tribute, slaves of Aztecs were sacrificed for gods. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, under the shadow of the towering templates, faced a fate more terrifying than battle or labor ritual sacrifice. These were not criminals or ordinary prisoners, but tribute slaves forcibly taken from conquered lands and delivered to the Aztec capital as living offerings. The Codex Mendoza, a 16th century record of the empire's tribute system, details how subjugated cities were required to send captives, men, women, and even children who would be reserved solely for religious slaughter. No event displayed this horror more than the Great Temple sacrifices of 1487. When thousands of victims were marched up the steep temple steps, their hearts torn out by priests wielding obsidian knives in a ritual that lasted for days. Spanish chronicler Bernal Díaz del Castillo in The Conquest of New Spain described witnessing these rituals, recalling the chilling sight of enslaved men waiting in terror. As the blood of those before them drenched the temple stones, the Aztecs believed these sacrifices were necessary to sustain the gods, ensuring the sun's rise and the rain's return. But for the tribute slaves, it was an inescapable fate. Whether they came from distant battlefields or tribute caravans, their lives were claimed long before the blade ever touched their chests. Human trafficking and slave markets in the Viking Age. The Vikings were not only known for their terrifying raids and conquests, they were also infamous for their role in the transcontinental slave trade during their raids across Europe and the British Isles. They captured men, women, and children, and sold them into slavery. These individuals were often sold in bustling slave markets in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Constantinople. The Vikings established a network of trade routes that connected them to vast empires where slaves were valuable commodities. Women were especially prized in these markets and could be sold for substantial sums, often exchanged for goods like silver, silks, and spices. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE marked the beginning of a long history of enslaving those they conquered once captured. These women were either forced into domestic labor or concubinage to serve powerful men in Viking society. Some women were lucky enough to be ransomed back to their families, but most endured harsh lives as thralls, often working in agriculture or domestic settings. Women in Viking raids were rarely treated as anything other than property exchanged for wealth and power. The reality of their lives was one of brutal subjugation and constant vulnerability under the control of their captives. These women were subjected to sexual exploitation and labor as commodities traded among the Viking elite. But their pain and suffering were largely ignored by history until recently with their stories. Buried beneath the heroic sagas of Viking warriors and kings, slave labor in ancient Egypt, the hidden cost of the pyramids. Ancient Egypt is remembered for its majestic pyramids and powerful pharaohs, but behind the grandeur lay a cruel system of forced labor. Contrary to the romanticized notion that slaves built the pyramids, many workers were actually prisoners of war or captives from neighboring regions, forced to work under harsh conditions for no reward. Thousands of slaves were conscripted to work in the stone quarries of Giza, chipping away at massive blocks of stone with rudimentary tools. These workers were exposed to extreme temperatures and brutal working conditions with little rest or food. They were worked to the brink of exhaustion, their bodies strained by the grueling labor. Some were shackled to prevent escape, while others were beaten into submission by overseers. As the pyramids rose above the desert, workers' bodies were buried beneath the weight of their labor, many dying from exhaustion, disease, or accidents. Their lives, which were sacrificed to build the tombs of kings, have left only traces in the archaeological record, offering a silent testament to the suffering they endured. The gruesome conditions in which they worked reveal the high human cost of Egypt's monumental achievements. The horrific reality of slave labor in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of slaves. These men, women, and children were often captured from conquered territories and forced to work in a variety of brutal roles, from agricultural laborers to gladiators. Slaves in the Roman Empire had few rights and were regarded as property rather than human beings. They were subjected to unimaginable cruelty with little hope of freedom. One of the most notorious roles for slaves was that of the gladiator. Many gladiators were prisoners of war or slaves who were forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of the Roman elite. They lived brutal lives, training in harsh conditions and fighting in bloody arenas. For many, the only escape from this life was death. The gladiatorial games were a symbol of Roman power, but they were also a grim reminder of the empire's reliance on slavery. Slaves were also used in the household, performing menial tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Many were forced to endure physical and sexual abuse at the hands of their masters. While some slaves could earn their freedom, the majority lived their lives in servitude. Their bodies and lives controlled by the will of their masters. Roman society was built on the suffering of its slaves, and their lives were sacrificed to maintain the empire's wealth and power. The fearsome female slaves of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire's legacy is often viewed as one of great power and cultural achievement, but behind its grandeur lay a dark history of human exploitation. Female slaves were an integral part of the empire, serving as concubines, domestic workers, and even soldiers. Many women were captured in raids or taken from conquered territories and sold into slavery. These women were often forced to live in her-like conditions where their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters. Some were chosen for their beauty and placed in the service of sultans or wealthy nobles, while others were subjected to grueling labor in the households of their owners. In rare cases, women who gained favor with their masters could rise to positions of power within the palace. However, the vast majority of female slaves were used as tools for pleasure or labor, their bodies commodified and exploited for the benefit of the elite. The suffering endured by these women was immense, and they had little recourse to escape their fate. While the Ottoman Empire was known for its wealth and cultural achievements, the plight of its female slaves was a dark and hidden side of its history. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the conquered were not merely enslaved, they were weaponized in the siege of Baghdad. Mongols forced thousands of captives, including civilians and slaves, to march ahead of their armies, absorbing enemy arrows before their own warriors struck. Those who refused were executed on the spot. This tactic was repeated in the Battle of Shenyang, where Kublai laid siege to the heavily fortified Song city. Chinese prisoners were strapped to siege engines, their bodies used as living armor. While Mongol engineers advanced under cover of their suffering, the Persian historian Atamalik Juvani in the History of the World Conqueror wrote that Mongols deliberately sent prisoners into hopeless charges, forcing them to weaken enemy lines. Before the real assault began, these men had no weapons, no means of escape, just the certainty that they would either fall to enemy fire or be trampled beneath Mongol cavalry. And when the battles were won, the survivors faced an even grimmer fate, slaughtered en masse to prevent rebellion or sent to the next war front, where their suffering would begin again.